Hey guys. Hey
Bev.
Jade. Hey Barb. It's Beverly.
Hello.
Beverly of Betterment with Beverly. That's a lot of B's. And we're going to talk about another B word, boundaries.
That's right.
Awesome.
Yeah, because I think we were thinking that boundaries is such a deep topic, and I know you all touched on it with one of your videos from a few weeks back. But it really is such a deep, deep topic, isn't it? And you hear people talk about
Yes.
boundaries lots, but when you ask them what boundaries mean for them, everybody has a different interpretation of that. And
Hmm.
one of the things that I have learned for myself with boundaries, because for a long time, I don't think I had any. I or wasn't aware that I had them. And so I think that's one of the big components is having those, setting some expectations for yourself, right? Knowing yourself, what your expectations are, and making sure you're communicating those to others. So having a little clarity on your boundaries is ever so important and such a challenge for folks, right? Because we have, at least I have lived a lot of my life with very unconscious boundaries and then be pissed off at somebody and they wouldn't know why because I hadn't set it up, or last week was okay and this week it's not, not being very consistent with them. So I'm kind of curious, and I would love to ask both of you if I can, to ask you to tell me what boundaries are the most difficult that you find. Like, what's the most difficult boundary in your life that you have to maintain and manage? Barb, would you like to go first, or?
Absolutely.
And
I
maybe Barb,
will.
tell us who you are and where we can find you.
Absolutely. So I am Barb with Best of Barb Wellness. And uh, I, this topic of boundaries for me is so important. And what I did, so before I go in and say what's the most difficult for me, I actually just went and uh, Googled what exactly boundaries is and what it means. So the actual definition of a healthy boundary are the limits that you place on your time, your emotions, your mental health, your body, in order for you to stay resilient and happy within yourself. And that made a lot of sense to me because for me, it's so important now. It wasn't before. It was kind of like pushed aside and fluffed aside before. But now, the importance for me to set my boundaries is much clearer and much more significant. It means something to me now. So for me, boundaries is respecting my time. I'm really starting to, especially now that I've, started my own business, my own coaching business, time, respecting my time with clients, respecting how much time I use to for my social media in order to, keep myself significant. Um, and also respecting my time with like family and friends and making sure that I'm not forgetting me with all of this, with everything that's going on in my life. So for me, it's been a time thing because I can so easily just, well, I'm sure everybody can relate to this. I can so easily get lost in time and just waste my time on
The
scrolling,
scrolling and the
the
swiping.
scroll.
Hmm.
Um, so I have to be very careful, and now I'm more mindful of that.
Yeah,
So that's
that's a great point. Being mindful on time is important. And that's what I would have said too. My husband would have said I've had some loosey goosey boundaries around time. And I'm getting better, it's progress. There's nothing that's, what is it, imperfect. Progress is good. But also like boundaries is back to what Beverly was saying with the expectations. And it's I have found in some of the areas boundaries with money. That's a big one for me. You know, is telling my truth, but taking action towards it with kids, for instance, allowances, you know, those kind of ground rules, for lack of a better phrase. So finances, kids, if you're looking at a family, need to recognize that there's an action or a request or whatnot, expectation to earn your allowance. And you know, when you know, having that conversation with the kids. It's like, well, you know, if I don't follow through, am I going to still get my allowance? Well, no, but then it's, for me, it was actually following through on the boundary of the consequence. Right. And so their dad was always threatening if they didn't do, said whatever. And then I'm like, well, you got to follow through now. So, you know, that was a whole other boundary, of course. So, yeah, it's following through when you establish a boundary. And so we always had that around allowance. Yeah. How about you, Beverly?
That makes sense.
Well, I think that's so true, and especially for parents, right? Following through on helping as coaches, what we do, right, is we help our clients stay accountable for what they want and they desire.
Exactly. It's the
And,
accountability.
right. And, but that following through part is so hard. And for me, that comes in relationships, you know, where if you know, if you say that to me one more time, or if you speak to me in that tone of voice. So I feel quite lucky that I got to practice a lot of my boundary setting through my work as a manager, you know, for been a manager for over 20 years. And therefore you have to have boundaries, because my job is to keep the place running and to, you know, do what I can to have a happy team. And part of that involves setting boundaries. So I used to think that I practiced those at work so that I could then use them in my personal life, because you're more intimate partners, it's a little bit harder to set those boundaries on. And especially as most humans, you know, are, for me anyway, I haven't always been very consistent with my, you know, what was important to me one week might just not be as important the next week. And I've never been a parent, so I've not had to worry about having those consistent messages when you're, you know, you're brewing your next one, you know, building that next generation, right? It's so important for kids to have boundaries, because I certainly know from my years in pediatric nursing that the most important things to kids, the happiest kids are those that have boundaries and know what those edges are. And so that's fascinating when you think of us as, because you're not born with boundaries, right? You learn them. And so when you think of it, right, through our childhood, we've probably had boundaries. Don't touch the stove, it's hot. You know, you don't eat that dessert before you eat your dinner, those kinds of things. And then we tend to lose them a little bit and then regain them or regrow them for ourselves, I suppose, as adults. And
like in your different roles.
yes, and different stages of life, right? It becomes very different. So there are some hard and fast boundaries that are just diehards for me. And then others that are a little bit more fluid based on the situation. You know, if you have somebody who's really upset and angry, you know, I've learned that through the years of dealing with unhappy customers or patients, you can't you shall not speak to me with a little bit. You have to give people a little leeway, you know, that sometimes they're just going to express themselves in a way that a week ago might not have been acceptable to you. But, you know, you have to have your safety boundaries on that.
Well, and as you're saying, it's the expression of, it's how we express the boundaries. Tone of voice has a lot to do with it, because you can get the other on the defense. I've been there. I've been on the defense when a certain tone was used. I understand boundaries. Please set them. Let me know what the confines are that, or the rules are of the game, we'll say, and then I can abide by them. But sometimes when boundaries are expressed in a tone of voice that gets the backup, it's You know, it's hard to communicate it. It kind of blocks communication, doesn't it? To your expectations or for somebody else receiving them.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
Mhm.
That makes sense. And that's why it is so important once you become aware of what you are giving away,
Mhm.
learning how to take it back
Mhm.
to improve, you know, on your life. And the number one thing, and this kind of ties in a little bit with what we talked about as a people pleaser, is to be more assertive.
Mm.
No means no, right?
Yeah.
In many different ways and in many different situations, but very much so with boundaries, is that don't be afraid to say no.
I
Don't be
think we said
afraid.
it's a full sentence.
Exactly. And it's not, you know, it doesn't matter what someone else thinks of
Mhm.
you. You know, just imagine that self-satisfaction when you actually say no.
Mhm.
It's,
Well,
isn't it, Barb? Saying no is always, that's negative, right? It has that negative feel. And so therefore the people pleasers, you know, those of us that are born and bred people pleasers, you have that connotation then, right? That you're doing something negative. But and you guys touched on that super briefly in your video before, in your discussion a few weeks ago. But truly, by saying no, you're setting that boundary, but you're truly saying yes to yourself,
mhm.
right? No is saying yes to self. And when you think of it in those terms, it doesn't, because then you can focus more on the positive end of that action.
Yeah, it's like an emotional boundary,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And then that ends up really empowering you to start or to continue to make those healthy choices for yourself. And by healthy, I, you know, I don't mean eating and stuff like that, but healthy, mental and physical choices for you, because now you're kind of taking that responsibility for yourself.
Mm.
And then you have no one else to blame but yourself if you take a step backwards.
Mhm.
And um
You don't like the outcome
yeah,
yeah.
type of thing,
because
isn't
if you step back, then somebody will take advantage. They'll slip in, right? They'll just
Yeah.
slide right in, and then you, okay.
And that's, I think, something as a coach that can really bring value to folks, because I have worked with clients who are unaware of that. And then they keep, you know, coming up with, you know, I did this, I did that, but they're truly not setting up clear boundaries, you know, or the boundary plus the parent Jade, their boundary plus consequence. You have to have a set in your mind of what no means. If this happens again, then, you know, I will not be speaking to you until you're able to, whatever, or whatever the situation is. Having that clear in your mind about what the potential consequence might be and communicating that to the others, because otherwise it's not fair to them to just keep saying, no, that doesn't work for me. That's not my boundary. You know,
yeah, that does that, where's the rules around
yeah.
around that? Mhm.
Yeah, because there is no, and especially in marriage, hey, Jumpin' Joseph, there is no guidebook on that that says, and we, you know, you live a life of crossing boundaries. The same with kids, right? Speaking of crossing boundaries, how do you know when you have crossed a boundary, either for yourself or for another? Like, what signals to you?
Well, for me, it's getting back to the tone of voice.
Yes.
When I recognize that I've crossed a boundary, even if I didn't know the rules or the boundaries, I can tell by the other communication through the tone of voice. That's why I brought it up. That's my indicator for sure. How about you, Barb?
For me, it is interesting. You said tone of voice. For me, it's body language.
Mm.
You can tell automatically. A person doesn't even have to speak. You can see it in their face. You can see the reaction, the shift in the body. when you know that you have crossed that line. And it's
Yeah.
only when you're aware, like a lot of people, you know, who cross your boundary may not even recognize it, and that's why they did it, right?
Right.
They don't backtrack. So it's so important to be aware of your boundaries, but also to be mindful of whether you're going to do that to somebody else. You know, it's kind of like, if you expect that respect, then you have to in turn give that respect,
Be the mirror.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Well said.
Especially, sorry, go ahead, Jade.
I was just going to point out, Barb, the body language is actually the largest way of communication or hearing communication. Yeah, there you go. There's some good body language right there. So thank you. Yeah, that's a great point. Look for it first. You'll see it before you hear it. Mm-hmm.
So, Barb, just to follow up on something you just
Yeah.
said about, you know, making sure you're respecting the other party as well, right? So when you talked about time, right, boundaries of time, making sure you come to your appointments on time, you know, you're not so, you know, sucked into the scrolling vortex that we can get into and be late for appointments, those sorts of things, right? I'm sure that's part of what's important to you is to be there on time. But when you have missed some boundary of time, what's your internal reaction when you recognize that you've crossed yourself, one of the boundaries you've set up for your self-care, for example, because we probably do have boundaries built into our lives, right, around our self-care, excuse me, around our self-care.
Yeah. Well, I'm, you know, to be open and honest, I'm still working on that. The one thing that I did learn with regards to time, and that was with a course that I took with the wonderful Joe Engleson, in the gratitude course that I participated in. And this is the one thing that, I mean, a lot of things stuck in my head, but the one thing that stuck in my head was this, you know, be respectful of your time and somebody else's time. And this is not like necessarily on the topic of boundary, but it kind of is, it kind of ties into that. So for me, I am very much aware now, if I have an appointment and I'm a couple of minutes late, a lot of times, you know, it could be the traffic, it could be, you know, could be anything completely out of my control, but it affects me in a different way now. I don't just fluff it off. I will, you know, even though I'll say to someone, you know, I apologize because the traffic, you know, all this kind of stuff. But the one thing that Joe was very clear on is that you can make all kinds of excuses, valid or not valid, but you're still disrespecting the other person's time. So what I'm trying to learn to do is give myself some extra, like build in that buffer for that, if it's appointments and stuff, for that extra traffic,
The unforeseens.
Yeah. Or if I know that I'm going to dinner at someone's house, making sure that, you know, I am on time. If they say 5 o'clock, then there's no such thing as being, what is it? They call it respectfully late or
Fashionably late.
Fashionably late. There's no fashion in being late. Like it's, you know, I'm learning that it's disrespectful to be late. If you're going to dinner and someone says 5 o'clock, they have a schedule and they want, you know, their meal to be out at a certain time. So, you know, that's their boundary, and you need to learn to respect that. So
I know,
it's still a work in process.
Yeah, and I get a physical feeling when I know I've crossed somebody else's boundary. Like I feel it in my gut. It's like, oops, you know, like automatically. my husband is a stickler. Like we're talking about time here. My husband is a stickler for time, and his is 15 minutes early is on time. I'm usually on time is a minute or two, give or take, either side of the appointment. So it is an interesting phase when we're showing our limits on our boundaries. But I feel it in my gut. Like that's where it's like, Jade, you're on the wrong. And
Yes.
I do listen to that, or you know, and then I take note, okay, well, you know, maybe being 15 minutes early isn't too bad, except for when you go for somebody's dinner, because I do not want anybody showing up at my house 15 minutes early.
No, right. I was thinking that when Barb was saying that, I thought, yikes, don't come 15 minutes early. I'm still scrubbing the toilets or
Well,
whatever.
so then here's the
TMI.
thing. You know, should you be scrubbing the toilets 15 minutes before guests arrive? Or technically,
Good point.
respecting your boundaries, should you not be, and I hate using the word should, you know, because we should on
Should all
ourselves
over
all the
ourselves.
time, but isn't it more important to have everything kind of all laid out to the point where, and I know a lot of people don't do this, probably most people don't do this, but where you are maybe sitting on the couch enjoying a glass of wine or something
In
before
anticipation.
before
I
your
think that
guests
happens on the
come.
soap operas. I've seen that occur on General
Not
Hospital.
in my house.
Yeah, no, I may not be scrubbing toilets, but I'm certainly applying some lipstick, running a comb through my hair, doing those last minute kinds of things. And
But
I
Barb
do.
brings up
I
a
would
good
never want to
point.
go to somebody. I would never though want to go early to somebody's house for like to come too early a little bit. But
And quite honestly, if I arrived, you know, 15 minutes early, I would probably stay in the car and just like seriously, and just that's when I can scroll
That's what you can
my
do.
phone. Hey, here's some, you know, dead time, dead air. I might as well just, you know,
Yeah.
scroll on my phone, see
That's a
who's, you
good
know.
point. That's a good
So,
point.
but yeah, I see that point as
yeah.
well.
Jade, I had to laugh when you said your husband's, 15 minutes early is his idea of being on time. And that it must be a male trait because that's my husband's as well. And we went for a dinner last week and it was slightly out of town. So we had some travel time. Anyway, we got there 45 minutes early.
Oh my goodness.
It was
Yeah.
fun. I mean, there was a few of us, so we got to sit because there was a couple of us in the car, and we got to sit and visit. But
So you waited in the car.
we went into that restaurant and got ourselves settled. However, there's balancing it both ways.
That's
Can
right.
I flip again and go back to something else? You mentioned being a parent earlier, and both of you women have raised some beautiful kids. So, when you have one of the things I've noticed, and I used to see it with the patients I worked with and nieces and nephews, give them a hug, thank you. When we have we don't always have those boundaries for our kids around, like for our own physical space. I tend to be a hugger and a toucher, which doesn't work for everybody. So I've kind of learned to use my intuition a little bit more, and sometimes even to ask, is it okay if I hug you? But when you're a parent with kids, was that something that you experienced that you would perhaps say to when they were little kids, hug Uncle Earl, thank you for the Christmas gift or something, right? As opposed to it just being
Oh yeah. I had to hug everybody. My mother was like, you make sure you had, I had so many aunties and uncles that, were all their friends. Cause I only had one uncle, but yes, all the time as a child, I was like, make sure you give them a hug and a thank you. And for myself as a parent, I did not do that with my kids. It was the way they thanked is the way they thanked. So that's a great question because I haven't really thought about it. I didn't have a boundary around, yes, make sure you say thank you if you received a gift, but no, not the same as I was brought up.
When you were a kid, do you think you recognized that as a boundary? Like that you were like, were you inside going, oh, for God's sakes?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's probably why I didn't push that.
Yeah.
We all have stuff in our in our backgrounds or whatever, that kind of, and so even just talking about it kind of raises a little something for me. So
Trigger.
yeah, a little trigger. I can feel it in there. Yeah. So no, yeah.
So you did not raise your kids that way. How about you, Barb? Did you have that experience growing up as a child where you were sort of, marched in front of whoever, right? And
A little bit. I mean, growing up in a very European kind of household, it was very different. There's, and it's funny because, there's always that uncle, that squeezes you too tight, or, just crushes your hand, or something like that. And I did have one in my family, Uncle Steve. Oh my goodness, Uncle Steve. And I have no problems saying his name. He's long since passed. And I mean, he was a lovely man, but he was a gruff man. But I did, and I I don't really, I mean, for the most part, my parents would say, don't forget to say thank you. I don't remember in my head whether they were saying, go give them a hug, or say thank you in that way. Um, I think it was just kind of expected, like when you left their house or whatever, you went and gave him a hug goodbye, or, something like that, which I'm a hugger, so it didn't really bother me in that way. I have to say, for my kids, the only thing I ever said was, just make sure that you say thank you. If they were given a gift, or I'd say, did you say thank you? I don't remember, it could be the brain fog, who knows, but I don't remember ever saying, go hug so and so, to say thank you. I think it was just verbiage that I did.
and
Why do you ask this question, Beverly?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm just curious about that, because that's something that's come up a lot, and you read it a lot in literature around raising kids and stuff, that sometimes you're pushing them outside of their comfort zones, right? And we often talk, when we talk, especially as coaches, about boundaries and stuff, we talk about ourselves, but it's often to have some awareness around those other folks that are here. I just had a little giggle and was thinking about when you guys were pregnant, and Jade, you were pregnant with twins, right? So you probably had the Toronto belly, and you know how people come up and touch you when, I mean, I was never pregnant, but I certainly have been guilty of going and squeezing a belly, or rubbing it like the Buddha for good luck or something, right?
I felt like a big Buddha.
I bet you did, with twins. How did that make you feel when people, without being invited, would come? And because that's truly a physical boundary, isn't it? Right?
It is a physical
Absolutely.
boundary. Yeah. And if you're asking me specifically, I do remember people doing that, but I found, for the most part, if they were a stranger, they always asked.
Okay, good.
Like women, not men, obviously, but when they found I was having twins, or because mine were always moving, from 4 months on, I swear. And I was big, so they, people would say, oh, can I touch and feel them move or whatever, and I was okay when they asked. I don't, it was a long time ago, it was like a quarter century ago. Well, 27 years ago, when I was pregnant. So I don't really kind of recall somebody just coming up and touching me. Thank goodness.
Maybe it was just me doing it to other people.
I'm sure you asked first, Beverly, right?
Yeah. And I think I'm in the same boat as Jade. When I was pregnant, well, with both my kids, so we had no family here in Calgary. It was just, myself and my husband. So, and we had few friends, especially when I was pregnant with my daughter, our first, and I was on the road a lot. So, I did have, people just asking me questions, but I don't even remember if anybody, reached out and said, oh, can I, give you a Buddha rub? And depending on who I was interacting with.
Yeah.
And how comfortable
Yeah.
I felt, like the vibe that I was getting. For the most part, there weren't any like creepy vibes kind of thing.
We would
From
remember
what
those
I
ones.
can remember. Yeah, those obviously, yes, that would be the kind of like, oh, I remember a time when somebody did, this, and I was like, ew, like, no.
Yeah.
I can remember sitting around with the nurses I would work with, and young women, a lot of them were pregnant, and that would be something that would come up frequently for them, is that their frustration when people would just come up and touch their belly, or because it's a big belly, get excited. I think in recent years we've all become a little bit more aware of those physical boundaries,
Yeah.
right? And
At least 6 feet.
right.
Yeah.
Well, trust me, I'm such a victim of, getting closer as you're talking. Even when I'm, I see myself
Zoom.
into the screen more, and, across the dinner table, I'm forever, probably part of why I have chronic back issues. I'm always leaning into something.
You're leaning in. You're engaged. That's awesome.
That's right.
That's a great boundary.
But it's hard when you're like standing in a hallway talking to somebody, right? And I did have that incident where I could clearly remember one friend of mine who had very, bigger boundaries than I did. And I can remember talking to her, and she kept stepping back and I kept stepping forward. And then her back was against the wall. And she said, "You're really invading my personal space." And I went, "Oh my God."
Because
Well,
you
this
weren't
is-
really aware.
I was just so excited about what we were talking about, right?
So this is how easily it is to
To
miss a
overstep.
boundary. Yeah. Barb.
Yes.
Without even having any awareness around that. And I think and again, in marriages, or when you have a host full of people, so many things come up, like boundaries around privacy, who's going to look in your purse, you're going to, like, how many times have your kids, you just said, "Go and grab my wallet from my purse," or grab some Kleenex in my purse or something, right?
And
So
then you got to think, what else is in my purse?
well, it's like that can be a boundary for a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
My husband, come hell or high water, would never open up the zipper in my purse, right? It's like he'll bring it to me.
He's scared. My husband was scared. Here you go. You get whatever out of
There's a
your
mystery. I think there's a mystery to the women's purse, right? Of what potentially, I don't know what they think we carry.
I think in the beginning of our marriage, I think my husband did that once or twice, where he went in to get something, and that was only
Never again.
Never again. No, now he brings.
That's his boundary.
And it's funny, right? Because you can, so like for me, I have a pretty loose boundary on that. It wouldn't bother me. But for my husband, it's one he wouldn't cross. So that's another interesting aspect of it, is that, what your boundaries are certainly not, you can't always assume what somebody else's is. Well, ladies, I think we've, probably gone a bit over time than what we were originally intending. But I really, I certainly enjoyed today's conversation and learned a lot from it as well. And it just continues to remind me that the topic of boundaries is really quite bottomless, right? You could
absolutely,
so many aspects of it. And certainly as coaches, it has been my experience with the clients I've had to date that a lot of the time we spend, although it might not always be labeled as boundaries, a lot of the discussions we have are around that, whether it's, time management to whatever it
Prioritizing self is a boundary.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Before we leave, Jade, I'm just recognizing that I didn't give you an opportunity for you to share how people can get in touch with you.
Sure, livingon10.com. Let's take our days a 10 out of 10. That's what I am, living on 10.
I love that motto. I
I
love that motto.
Well, this has
Thanks so
been
much.
wonderful. Thank you, ladies. I'll see you again soon.
Sounds good.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.